Welcome to this, the 7th annual Dame Eugenia Child's Distinguished Lecture. The topic of Heroes and Heritage, the contribution of George James Christian of Dominica to the social, political, and legal landscape of Ghana, 1900 to 1940. Our distinguished lecturer this evening is Professor Margaret Rouse-Jones, former campus St. Augustine and UWI librarian. And I may be wrong, but I believe that this is the first time that the distinguished lecturer at this series has been a woman. And maybe that's providential, because obviously Dame Eugenia Childs was a very distinguished woman who served Dominica, and not only Dominica but the Caribbean, with great dignity and with, a world reach. Her personality impacted well beyond Dominica. This evening we will be hearing about George James Christian. I think this evening's lecture will be an eye-opener for most Dominicans, and I hope many people are listening on the radio, in addition to those who are here tonight. Because not many of us know of George James Christian, his very existence, his origins in Dominica, and his impact on what was in those days the Gold Coast colony, now the country, the nation of Ghana in Africa. I myself first heard of him in the early 70s from a man that most of us may remember, but few would connect. Hakim Gordon, who came to Dominica in the early 70s and lived here for many years. Incidentally, he was the grandson of George James Christian and connected to the very distinguished Christian family in Dominica, who in so many ways have contributed to life in this country. So the revelation of this man who left here in the very beginning of the 20th century and moved from Dominica through England, where he became a lawyer, to Africa, to Gold Coast, now Ghana, was a very unusual process in those days, and even today. There are other Dominicans who have served. Our former president, Dr. Nicholas Liverpool, served in Ghana for some years. And of course, we just last week commemorated the passing of the very distinguished Bishop Bishop Bowers. Age is catching up. But Bishop Bowers was another Dominican who left Dominica and experienced a very distinguished career, being the first black man to be ordained a bishop in the United States of America. And from what I understand, in, of all places, Mississippi, which was the center of racism and of Ku Klux Klan and things like that. So Bishop Bowers must have had a very difficult time in his early years. And he moved to Ghana and became a beloved bishop in that country, commemorated now by many people in Ghana, and of course by us in Dominica, as a son of this soil. We are privileged this evening to have with us, as our distinguished lecturer, Professor Margaret Diane, I hope I'm correcting it, pronouncing it correctly, Diane Rouse-Jones, University College, Dip Literature, LIS, Literature, yes. Bachelor of Arts, University of the West Indies, Master of Arts, and PhD, Johns Hopkins University. And just in passing, I would mention that another distinguished Dominican, is also a graduate of Johns Hopkins University, and that's our beloved Dr. Carissa Etienne, recently elevated or elected to the position of Director General of PAHO. So, Professor Rouse-Jones is in distinguished Dominican company. But we are very privileged to have her here tonight, and I think I can do no better in introducing her than to read the notes on the program this evening about her background and her career. Professor Margaret Diane Rouse-Jones received a Bachelor of Arts degree in French and Sociology from the University of the West Indies, St. Augustine in 1971. She obtained her Master's of Arts degree in 1974 and her PhD in 1977 in history from the Johns Hopkins University in Maryland, USA. In 1981, she graduated with a diploma in Library and Information Studies from University College in London, United Kingdom. Professor Rouse-Jones has worked as an information professional since 1966. Much of her career was spent working with West Indian special collections and other heritage materials at UWI St. Augustine campus libraries. In 1997, she was appointed campus librarian at UWI St. Augustine. In 2004, she became UWI's university librarian. In that same year, she was honored with the UWI Vice Chancellor's Award for Excellence in the Service to the University Community category at the Award for Excellence in Research and Publications and the Award for Excellence in Research and Publications in the Information Field in the Caribbean from the Association of Caribbean University Research and Institutional Libraries, ACURIL. In 2008, she was awarded the Caribbean Information Professional of the Year by the same organization, ACURIL. She has assisted many organizations and committees. Among them, she serves as a member of the selection committee for the Fulbright Foreign Student Fellowship Program and was the first chairperson of the board of the National Library and Information Systems Authority of Trinidad and Tobago. She is past chairperson of the Trinidad and Tobago National Committee for UNESCO's Memory of the World Program and past vice president of the Regional Committee for Latin America and the Caribbean for UNESCO Memory of the World Program. Professor Rouse-Jones is a much sought-after public speaker. She has delivered numerous addresses throughout the region based on her experience as both historian and librarian. She is committed to the development of Caribbean people through literacy and access to information and innovation. She has published in the area of history, historiography. Excuse me. It's a new word for me. And Caribbean bibliography. Professor Rouse-Jones is from Belmont in Trinidad. She and her husband, Rupert, have been married for 36 years, and they have one daughter. So it's a great privilege for me to be able to introduce Professor Rouse-Jones to this audience and to be invited to chair these proceedings. I think we will all be greatly informed, and our national pride will be elevated after we have heard something about George James Christian, Dominican, member of a very distinguished Dominican family who has served the country in so many ways over so many generations. So it is my pleasure and privilege now to introduce to us Professor Margaret Rouse-Jones, our distinguished lecturer this evening. Thank you very much.
His Excellency, the President, Mr. Eliud Williams and Mrs. Williams, Sir Brian Aline, former Chief Justice of the Eastern Caribbean Supreme Court and the Master of Ceremonies, thank you for your very generous introduction. Mrs. Hazel Cadet, the General Manager acting of Fort Young Hotel. Monsignor William John Lewis, Director of the Diocesan Pastoral Center. Ms. Kimone Joseph, Marketing and Outreach Officer of the UE Open Campus, Dominica. The students and staff members of the Open Campus and staff of the Fort Young Hotel. Distinguished ladies and gentlemen all, both here and those listening via Kyrie FM radio. And just in case I have left out anybody, I will do as the lawyers do and say all protocols observed. Good evening, and it is a pleasure to be able to deliver the 7th Annual Distinguished Dame Eugenia Charles Lecture, and I would really like to thank the Open Campus for giving me this opportunity to share the research on George James Christian, which I've been working on for several years. As you have heard, he was a native of Dominica, and he made a successful life for himself and his family in the Gold Coast, which is now Ghana. I will be referring to it as the Gold Coast as I talk, because, you know, I'm a historian talking in the past. Now, this distinguished lecture series also honors Dame Eugenia Charles, and so I will include her in discussion and make some links as well. To give you a bit of background, my research had its genesis in a friendship with Estelle Appiah of Ghana, who is one of George Christian's granddaughters. When we first met in London as postgraduate students in 1974, she indicated that she had West Indian roots. That was one of the first things she said to me. I remember thinking then that generally West Indians wish they could trace or find their African roots. And here was a quote-unquote African acknowledging her West Indian roots. And as we became good friends and she shared the details of the story of her Dominican-born grandfather, I told her that she was sitting on a good story. And over the years, we have been conducting the research together on Christian since 1991 in archives and libraries, as well as oral history interviews in Dominica, in London, in England, in Ghana, and in Trinidad and Tobago. We have also taken advantage of every opportunity to disseminate our research findings, either singly or together at meetings on both sides of the Atlantic. 2 short pieces have been published while we continue to work on a full-length biography, which we hope to complete within the next 2 to 3 years. And so it is a great honor for me to have this opportunity to share the research on George James Christian of Dominica and the Gold Coast in the land of his birth. And I really do thank you all for being here. I've titled the lecture of Heroes and Heritage, and I will use as a backdrop a viewpoint of Dame Eugenia Charles on the subject of heroes and national pride. In an address marking the 12th anniversary of independence in 1990, Dame Eugenia highlighted the issue of who qualifies as national heroes. She cited 4 categories: the Carib and Arawak ancestors, our forebears of African descent, the latter-day heroes, for example, Charles Faulkner, Cecil Rawle, and Christopher Loblack. They fought against the colonial powers. And I'm focusing on her 4th category, where she mentions those who achieved fame not necessarily in Dominica, but in other parts of the world, where their accomplishments caused others to take notice of Dominica. And as an example, she mentioned Dr. Philip Potter, who was the Secretary General of the World Council of Churches, and she also mentioned Telford Georges, who was a renowned jurist. And she stated, "These sons and daughters of Dominica, many of them living abroad, have helped to build our reputation as a proud and hard-working people, and we must recognize their worth and their contribution to our nationhood. We must be proud of them." So that is the context in which I am presenting the main subject of this lecture, George James Christian. On the theme of heritage, I cite Professor Gordon Rollier, who defines a sense of heritage as being the shadow and substance of passing and current lifestyles, as well as the interlinkages between them. In other words, it is the traditions people live by, their legacy, what will be handed down from them through the generations, both tangible and intangible. A columnist in the Jamaican Observer, in considering those who are held up as heroes, recently noted that it is necessary to have an understanding of their lives and sacrifice within the context of the times in which they lived. In a sense, this is obvious. What he's saying is that you need information about people and their experience before decisions can be made about the value of their contribution. However, when you are looking back in history, as we are doing, the issue of documentary heritage, something with which librarians, are very much concerned, takes center stage. Now, Christian, I have to say, had a keen sense of heritage. And that's the reason why we can interrogate his life. He realized that he had deviated from the norm and that it was important for him to document his experience. The personal papers which he left date back from 1890 and have allowed his granddaughter and myself to flesh out his story. The papers consist of over 5,000 items. And it's a variety of documents. I've given the list of the different types of documents there. He was very meticulous in his record keeping. He had a filing system for his correspondence. He kept all the letters he received as well as copies of his replies. And he even had important letters retyped. And I mean, as a librarian, I really was amazed at this. He retyped letters on better quality paper to ensure their longevity. He wrote to his children, and he encouraged them to respond as well as to write to one another. He kept in touch with all his relatives and friends in Dominica right to the end of his life. In 1899, the year that he left Dominica to study in England, he kept a diary, and that is the only diary that I have found in the papers. And it clearly shows that he was someone with a plan who put measures in place to ensure that it would be realized. His papers were safely kept by his daughter, Essie Foster, and they were subsequently donated to UWI St. Augustine Library, where they are available for the use of scholars and researchers. They were formally handed over by his granddaughter, Mrs. Estelle Appiah, with another granddaughter, Dr. Maud Christian Meyer, as witness in June 2005. Okay, let me now share some of the details of his life. He was born on February 23rd, 1869, in the village of, and I hope I'm pronouncing this correctly, Delices, okay. He was named after his father, who was a solicitor from Antigua, who had moved to Dominica. The young Christian was educated at the Maico Training College in Antigua in the late 1880s, after which he returned to Dominica and served as a school teacher. At the Maico College, he was apparently influenced by one of his teachers, Charles Farquhar, who subsequently served as a priest in Guinea. In an 1890 letter congratulating Farquhar on his ordination and posting to Africa, Christian and his roommate, Sheriff Bowers, expressed their pleasure at his success and hoped that his experience would encourage others to follow in his footsteps. Now, when Christian left Dominica in 1899 to study law at Gray's Inn, he became involved in the African Association, which had been founded in 1897 by Henry Sylvester Williams from Trinidad. Williams had been planning for the famous First Pan-African Conference at least a year before Christian arrived in London. Now, Christian not only attended the conference in 1900, but he participated actively. He gave a presentation, and his contribution was a wide-ranging survey of conditions in Africa, which clearly demonstrated that he had knowledge and understanding not only of the atrocities of slavery, but also of the continued domination and exploitation of African states by the colonization process. He called for guaranteed protection by laws which no colonial legislation could alter, and no prejudiced judge pervert. In the wake of the conference, a permanent Pan-African Association was formed, and Christian served as treasurer of that association. He was called to the bar on June 11, 1902. Now, his migration to the Gold Coast on the completion of his legal training was in fulfillment of a goal he had set for himself. In one of his speeches, Christian reminisced that he had had some idea, and those are his exact words, of coming to Africa as home. And that on the night when he was called to the bar, he asked Sir Philip Crampton Smiley, who was serving in Sierra Leone at the time, where in Africa he would recommend. And Smiley's advice to Christian was as follows. He said, "Well, I would not advise you to go to the Gambia. Sierra Leone is overcrowded. Nigeria, I know nothing about. But if you are worth your salt, try your luck on the Gold Coast." And Christian did. He settled in the town of Sekondi in 1902, a busy port on the coast. Now, before I leave the subject of his return to the Gold Coast, I want to interject another aspect of his ideology of returning to Africa, based on an exchange of correspondence between him and the recently deceased Bishop Joseph Oliver Bowers. Now, let me give you a brief summary about Bishop Bowers, and then I will, share the bit. Now, Bishop Bowers, whose experience is also important in terms of the length of his service and the impact that he has had on the Catholic Church in Ghana. He was born in 1910, and he was the son of Sheriff Bowers. He studied, as we heard, for the priesthood in the USA and was ordained in 1939, and he arrived in the Gold Coast for the first time in 1940 at the age of 30. In 1953, he was appointed bishop to Accra, and he's credited with having completed in 1957 both the building of the Cathedral of the Holy Spirit and the founding of the Congregation of Sisters of the Handmaids of the Divine Redeemer, which was dedicated to caring and comforting the poor. The substantial increase of the Catholic population and parishes in Ghana, as well as the growth in size of the priesthood and laity, are attributed to his visionary and dynamic leadership. Now, Bowers did return to the Caribbean in 1971, and from his base in Antigua, he served for 10 years as bishop for the newly constituted diocese made up of several islands until his retirement in 1981. And thereafter, he returned to his home in Dominica and lived humbly and without fanfare, being cared for by his sister. The indelible mark which he left on Catholicism in Ghana is evidenced by the fact that he migrated there a second time in 1997 at the invitation of the Congregation of Sisters he had founded. And at the age of 90, he was still serving as their spiritual director. He celebrated his centenary on the 28th of March, 1910, at the convent where they were looking after him. And in recognition of his accomplishments, the government of Ghana decorated him with the Order of the Volta. And he died, as we heard, very recently. It was the 6th of November, 2012, at the age of 102. Now, when I visited Dominica in 1993, I met Bishop Bowers, and so I feel really very special. And he and I actually corresponded for about 3 years after he went back to the Gold Coast. He wrote to me, and I kept those letters, so, I feel really privileged. But when I interviewed him, I wanted to talk to him about his experience in the Gold Coast, but mostly about his relationship with Christian. And he told me that he didn't know very much about Christian. They had met on only one occasion, when he was a young boy with his father. He had written him a letter when he arrived in the Gold Coast in 1940, but he never received a response. There's the letter. Although Christian's son informed him that a reply to the letter was on his father's desk after he died. And the two letters are in the GJC papers. And now that is the original letter that Bishop Bowers wrote to Christian. Now, what I'm saying is that a comparison of the experience of Christian and Bowers, although a generation apart, is interesting and relevant to an understanding of why they went back to Africa. Both left Dominica in search of professional training. Both gave a good portion of their life to the development of the society in Ghana. The evidence suggests that their education gave them an awareness of aspects of life in Africa, which planted in them a desire to return there. Bowers's father and Christian had shared a common experience. They had both been educated at the Micro Institution in Antigua. I don't think I've mentioned it before, but they were roommates. So George James Christian and Bishop Bowers' father were roommates in college in Antigua. And I'm suggesting, as Bowers said, his father often spoke about Christian and spoke about their time at the Micro Institution, and that he must have shared with his son aspects of what he had been taught. Now, Christian's letter to Bowers is very instructive in shedding light on his ideology of return. Rehearsing the experience of the Middle Passage, he considered that his return to the Gold Coast was ordained by Providence, that he was privileged to be there, and that he had a duty to perform. And I'll just read snippets. He said, "Fancy two Dominicans, both associated with the Micro College, should meet in Africa. You to labor in the Master's vineyard, and I to plead on the seat of mercy, as too often happens on behalf of our race and people. Truly, the ways of Providence are beyond our comprehension." And then he mentioned the suffering that our people went through when being brought from Africa to the West Indies. And he says, "Providence has ordained it that we, the descendants of those unfortunate exiles, should return to the fatherland and give the benefit of our experience to the descendants of those who were responsible for the cruelty inflicted upon our ancestors. It is our privilege to be here. We have got a duty to perform by our fellows, even though at times they may sneer at us as returned exiles." So I'm saying that Christian was obviously well schooled in the atrocities of slavery and was of the view that it was, I say, divinely ordained. He used the term providence, that he should give back to his ancestors and their homeland. He also recognized the comparable elements between his own experience and that of his roommate's son. So let us look now at his legal career. He used his training in a variety of ways, and his professional success was obviously evident fairly soon after his arrival in the Gold Coast in 1902, and continued throughout his life there. 1 year after his arrival, he established a firm, a legal firm, Messrs. Christian and Leung, with a Francis Leung of British Guyana. He also became a concessions lawyer dealing with concessions for gold mining, and he had a private practice in Sekondi and in Tarkwa. As early as 1903, he was involved in the famous SCM Muir murder case, which ended with the acquittal of the accused. The Crown had produced no substantial evidence to send the accused to trial at the assizes, and evidence rested on suspicion against the accused, and he was congratulated in the media for his able defense of the accused. Another case that he took up was representing some chiefs in a matter regarding the acquisition of lands for this construction of the Takoradi Harbor Scheme. And in this case, his social conscience came to the fore. He sought advice in preparing, his statements and arguments from a consultant engineer as well as from an English lawyer, and he had paid these people for their services. And throughout, it was a really long case, and throughout the case, he had a lot of difficulty receiving payment for his services from the chieftains that he was representing. But in the letters, he said, I have to continue to provide legal counsel because I gave them my word. I gave them my word that I would see them through. And because I realized that a mean advantage will be taken of them, I have to stick to my guns. So the fact that they weren't forthcoming in paying him, he didn't let that stop him from doing his duty by them. His knowledge in property law was often consulted, and he also took cases dealing with the establishment of legal ownership through the possession of land. He provided legal counsel for companies in the process of debt collection. Now, one of his most outstanding achievements as a legal luminary in the Gold Coast was the prominent role he played in the opening up of the Ashanti region to legal practitioners. He served as a counsel in the famous trial for Benjamin Knowles. He was an Englishman who was convicted of the murder of his wife and sentenced to death upon trial in Ashanti without the benefit of a jury and the services of counsel. Christian's concern with the case was not whether Dr. Knowles was guilty or not, but with the fact that the system was antiquated. In Britain, he argued one was entitled in capital offenses to a trial by judge and jury. However, in Kumasi, this was not the case, and he hoped that the outcome of the case would be to the benefit of all people, irrespective of race. The appeal was heard in the Privy Council, and after intense consideration of the Ashanti Administration Ordinance, the conviction was overturned. And again, he was congratulated in the media. Press reports and legislative council discussions summarizing his legal career indicate that in his conduct of law cases, he was a vigorous, a generous, and sportsmanlike opponent. His concern for mankind at every level of society led him to defend many poor persons free of charge. He maintained good relations with all strata of society, both Europeans and Africans, and he was in no way discriminatory in the help he gave to all. He acted with promptitude and consideration for all his clients, presenting cases fairly, honestly, and conscientiously. Alongside his legal career, Christian became increasingly involved in the political life of the community. He served in the Sekondi Town Council from 1911 to 1950 and from 1920 to 26. In 1927, a constitutional change granting the town representation in the Legislative Council required that candidates be nominated and qualified for nomination following strict criteria. And in the reports about the 1927 election in which he took part, shed light on the dynamics of integration into Gold Coast society both from an internal and external point of view. There were two candidates contesting the election, Paisley Hayford, who was from the Gold Coast, and Christian. And Christian, who did not have the backing of any organization, was relying on his personal reputation. However, he experienced an unrelenting defeat in the election, 126 votes and he got 25. And the newspaper reports in the wake of the election offered a rebuke to those who had tried to pitch their claims for recognition against those of such a veteran as the Honorable J.E. Paisley. However, with time, Christian gained acceptance, and following on the death of Paisley, and this is significant, the second Municipal Electors Association proposed him as their nominee to succeed the deceased. And he was elected as a member, a municipal member of the Legislative Council for secondly, and re-elected for 2 successive terms, and then served there continuously until his death. Throughout his terms in the Legislative Council, his contribution to the discussions were wide-ranging and gave a clear indication of his commitment and contribution to Gold Coast society, which he had made his home. And I give some of the subjects that he raised in the discussion: the inadequate education facilities in Takoradi. And he pointed out the fact that the schoolmasters and teachers had to be paid a wage that would make them take an interest in their work. Sounds like today, doesn't it? And keep the best of them at their profession. He talked about the reduced medical establishment in the Western Province. And he wanted the governor to provide more doctors in the medical department, and also to establish an examining board to look at the native herbalists. So, he was concerned with both sides of the medical issues. He also opposed the income tax and native revenue bill on the grounds that the taxpayers could not afford to pay, and there would be no machinery for collecting the tax, and it would cause an upheaval. And then he also talked about the discrepancy between the salaries paid to European medical officers and their African counterparts, and that really occupied his attention. In one of his contributions, he referred to having visited Trinidad and commented on whether the Imperial College, which is a forerunner to UWI's university, in which the Gold Coast government had paid thousands of pounds. He wondered whether it was meeting the manpower needs of the Gold Coast in the area of agriculture. And as a result of his intervention, arrangements were made for 2 Gold Coast students who had recently qualified with their undergraduate degrees in California to be admitted for the associateship, which is a postgraduate course, in the year 1982. And I did go and do research and I definitely saw that one of them completed their thesis. I'm not sure what the other one did. We certainly, one certainly did complete. The final case I would mention that came up was a matter raised by him in the 1930-31 session about the construction of a bridge at Bibusu, and it was approved in 1934. Now, when it was approved, Christian then raised questions about who would undertake the construction, because he knew from his experiences in Dominica of a bridge which had not been properly constructed and which was washed away before it was opened by the government. You haven't heard the rest. A particular engineer fled Dominica and turned up, yes, where, as chief engineer of the Gold Coast. Christian made a strong plea for first-class engineers with the best brains to do the work. So this brief survey of his performance in the Legislative Council gives a clear indication that his experience and his training permitted him to make valid contributions on a wide range of subjects. It also demonstrates his commitment the justice and equality for all in this society that he had made his home. He also served as Liberian counsel for 30 years. And this was a position that he acquired on account of his personal friendship with Edwin Barclay, who became the president of Liberia. In this capacity, he was responsible for the welfare of Liberians. He looked into the issue of the charges the government was making to the steamship companies, the issues of issuing of visas and so on. He was invited to the inaugural ceremonies in 1936 in Liberia, and he was also honored by the Liberian government as a Knight Commander of the Star of African Redemption. He was also a Freemason, and this was in furtherance of a tradition which had been passed on to him from his father, who had introduced him to the Odd Fellows Society. And I picked up this little snippet of information in a letter that he had written in 1890, that his father had introduced him to the Odd Fellows Society, and that is a forerunner of the Freemasons. And when he went to London, he continued to pursue his interest in Freemasonry, and he was initiated into a Middlesex Lodge in 1901. And in the Gold Coast, he encouraged fellow Freemasons to join him and founded the lodge in Secondi, and he was also responsible for the spread of Masonry in Kumasi and the Cape Coast. And he was also honored for his work in that area. Now, apart from his legal career and his membership in the Legislative Council, he was a man of varied interests, and he was active in all aspects of life. And I just list some of the things that he did. He was the Deputy President of the British Red Cross Society. He was on the Gold Coast Advisory Committee for students proceeding to the United Kingdom for the purposes of study. He was a patron of the Society for African Herbalists. This is a society that aimed to preserve the knowledge of healing powers of native plants and to improve the local practice of medical herbalism through experiments and research. He was also a philanthropist par excellence. I mean, he was always giving money to this, that, and the other cause. And when there was a serious earthquake in Accra, he sort of headed an earthquake relief fund and gave a very generous donation. Empire Day celebrations, he's vice president on that committee as well. And there were a host of others. The colonial secretary, in an address to the Legislative Council when Christian passed away, remarked that no one who had the privilege of listening to him could fail to observe the keen enthusiasm, the conviction, and the deep sincerity that marked all his public work. Now, in the course of his life and activities, he was also connected with a lot of significant people, and I mentioned these two. One of them was Dr. James Kwesi Agri, who is known as the Agri of Africa. Some of you know about him. He was an intellectual, a missionary, and a teacher. He was educated in the United States, and the Gold Coast government had brought him back to assist with the establishment of Hachimota School. And the other person that Christian also met while he was there was George Padmore, a very well-known Pan-Africanist of Trinidad, who is still remembered in Ghana. Padmore served with Nkrumah. Now, in the papers, there are a couple of interesting pieces of correspondence, especially with Agri. And they are important because they provide interesting insights into Agri's thoughts and emotions. And they're important in light of the fact that Agri died very unexpectedly, not long after they were written. And you know how it is when you write your friend and you pour your gut out. So those letters are in the papers. I mean, they're unique. They're not anywhere else, so they're really quite to find. In Padmore's case, he regretted the brevity of his visit Christian and hoped to meet him again in Liberia. And I make the point that these associations are significant, as is the fact that Christian left a record of them. Okay, we're now going to look at his family life. The correspondence and our record give an insight into his family life. He had 3 Dominican-born children, Clara, Peter, and Mona. In the Gold Coast, he had several other children. According to one of his granddaughters, and I'm quoting her, she said he became an African in the true sense of the word. He had children by more than one woman, and he was married to the mothers of those children by what was called at the time native law and custom. These are the African-born children: Sarah, Josephine, and Joseph. Their mother was Mary Abba Akon, and Angela Amber Christian. Her mother was Cecilia Adjua Feli. I don't have a picture of her mother. And then the other group of children were the children of Abba Lucy French, and she was his wife at the time of his death. And she was the mother of 5 children. Generally, Christian held strong views and maintained high values, which he always tried to impart to his children. He was concerned about their welfare, and he never passed up an opportunity to assist them in establishing their careers. They were all well educated in England, and as a part of his legacy in the Gold Coast, among his children there were 2 nurses, 2 doctors, 2 lawyers, and a diplomat. His son Peter, the Dominican-born son, he studied dentistry at Howard University, and he practiced here in Dominica. And Christian also assisted 2 nieces who remained in Dominica with funding for their education. He continued to be concerned about the welfare of his children all his life. And in particular, his oldest child. Now, he sent her to do medicine at Edinburgh University, but she gave up the studies and got married. The marriage didn't quite work out, and she had 6 children. And he ended up, helping her with their education as well. She was the mother of Happy Gordon that Sir Bruce, Sir Brian mentioned. His Dominican-born daughter, Maud Mary, who joined him in the Gold Coast and really made an outstanding contribution as well. She died of black water fever at the age of 34. And you should see the reports in the papers and so on at the time of her death. She had one of the biggest funerals, they said, at the time and so on. And she is still memorialized at the hospital where she worked as a midwife and native of Dominica, British West Indies, to the facilities donated by her father in her name. Now, by 1908, Christian had become a property owner and landlord, and he put the stamp of his West Indian heritage on the Secondi community by naming his house Dominica House. That was him. The original structure, which he originally rented out, was rebuilt some years later, and the result was this mini castle. In the press reports while it was being built, that Royal Christian is building this house, and they said that the architecture and beauty were unequal and unquestionable. Now, Christian also acquired property in Dominica, one of which was named Secondi House, which you probably know about, which he bought for his Dominican son Peter. And the way I see that, he named it Secondi House so that his descendants in Dominica will also be reminded of their ancestor who had returned to the Gold Coast. Okay, we're now going to shift gears a bit, and we will turn the spotlight on Dame Eugenia Charles and her family and compare their experience with Christians. Now, one of Dame Eugenia's biographers has made the point that the fact that she went abroad to study law and formed a political party and became a prime minister is just what one would expect from a daughter of J.B. Charles. So I had to look at J.B. Charles. John Baptiste Charles was a contemporary of Christian, and although their lives took a different direction, there were some commonalities both in their experience and in that of their children. In 1899, when Christian was preparing to go to London to study law, he went throughout Dominica, either on bicycle, horseback, or by boat, engaged in a variety of enterprises to fund his studies, one of which was the shipping of limes to Bermuda and New York. But J.B. Charles also engaged in this activity in 1911, and he also went on to export lime juice several years later. Both of them impressed upon their children the value of education. Eugenia's brother reported that his children's education was the most important to their father, more so than politics or business. Christian also felt strongly that education was the only means whereby a person of African descent could have attained a decent lifestyle, and he reminded his children of this whenever an opportunity arose. Their daughters attended the same school in Dominica. In 1913, Christian was supporting his daughter Maud as well as his nieces Marjorie and Christiane at the convent of the Faithful Virgin in Lucy. And Eugenia's biographer tells us that she was always a fighter ever since her days at the said convent in the 1920s. Both J.B. Charles and G.J. Christian had children who took up the profession of medicine and law. Charles's two sons, Rennie and Lawrence, attended medical school in Scotland. Christian's two youngest sons, Ferdinand and Edward, were doctors in Ireland. On a light-hearted note, J.B. Charles has recorded in his unpublished biography that in 1919, when Dominica had only the first 3 bicycles, he bought for a little over £2 the pneumatic tire bicycle owned by the famous Christian, the schoolmaster, who left to go to England to study law and who became one of the foremost lawyers in West Africa. So we can say that J.B. Charles and G.J. Christian rode the same bicycle. Now, interestingly, there are also commonalities in the next generation. Dame Eugenia and Christian's youngest daughter, Essie, Matilda Forster, they both qualified as lawyers in England. Dame Eugenia was at Inner Temple in 1947, and Essie was at Gray's Inn in 1945. And both these women have the distinction of being the first woman lawyer in their respective countries. Both were members of the International Federation of Women Lawyers and served the organization at the level of president. Dame Eugenia was president at the international level, and Essie Forster was president at the national level in Ghana. Now they did meet twice, first briefly in Dominica, and later that year they both attended the FIDA conference in New Mexico, where they had more meaningful interaction. Essie had reported that Dame Eugenia was friendly and offered her assistance with matters related to the Christian estate. And subsequently, Dame Eugenia Charles was one of the lawyers acting on behalf of the beneficiaries of Christian with regard to the settlement of his properties in Dominica. So it was fitting that I shared the research on Christian at this Dame Eugenia Charles lecture. In winding up this review of his contribution, I will now consider just very briefly his relationship with the other West Indians there. Because in the record, we are told that he was representative of a small group of West Indian professionals who returned to the Coast during the first 4 decades of the 20th century. And like him, they had come to offer their skills and make better lives for themselves. Now, there are few official statistics, but I did find a 1931 census document which said that there were 20 West Indians among the non-Africans in the Coast, 17 men and 3 women. And then a 1937 source also said that there were 3 legal practitioners from the West Indies. Well, one of those would have been Christian, and 6 of the 13 doctors in the Gold Coast were West Indians. I have some more information, but I think I'm just going to leave it. Eugenia's famous statement during the events surrounding the intervention in Grenada in 1983, which highlighted her belief in the oneness of the region when she said that we belong to each other, we are kith and kin. That sentiment precisely describes the nature of the interaction between Christian and the West Indian community in the Gold Coast. That's how they lived, as kith and kin. They gravitated, the West Indians gravitated to each other, and ties of family, friendship, and professional solidarity played a significant role in their lives. For example, when Christian first arrived in the Gold Coast, and he was alone without accommodation, it was another West Indian by the name of Leonard Moss who heard about him by accident, befriended him, and offered him assistance. And as a community, they were homogeneous, providing services, social life, and support to one another in various ways. There was one report where Christian used his legal training and expertise to assist one of the widows whose West Indian husband had died in getting her husband's pension. And then when there was another member, Hoyt, who was awarded an MB, they all hosted a function celebrating. Now, Dominica House, that you saw earlier, was the venue for many annual gatherings of the West Indian community. And one of the West Indians who I'm especially mentioned, he's in the bottom right-hand corner, George Stanley Lewis. Now, he was the brother of Sir Arthur Lewis, you know that famous West Indian family in St. Lucia. He went to the Gold Coast in 1929, and he outlived all of his West Indian players there. In fact, I met him when I went in 1994. And he made the point that few of the West Indians who went ever brought wives with them. They married local women and seldom returned to the West Indies. And he was of the view that the gatherings which Christians organized did much to knit the small group of West Indians together. Christian died in the Gold Coast on April 17, 1940 at the age of 71. On his death, the governor deemed his loss as irretrievable. He's buried in the European cemetery alongside his daughter Maud, where, as in life, he's identified with his homeland. As you see there, on his tombstone, on the 2 tombstones, say native of Dominica. I actually took that picture. I'm winding up. In context of heroes and heritage, I have illuminated the life of George James Christian and briefly Bishop Joseph O. Bowers, who made significant contributions to the legal, political, social, and religious life of the Gold Coast Ghana society, respectively. They were prompted by ideological reasons, a desire to return to their ancestral home to give something back. They, together with other West Indian professionals, were generally successful, kept in contact, and collaborated with each other. A study of Christian's life and experience fits into the literature on the Back to Africa movements, of which West Indian returnees and their communities are a part. Christian might be considered a West Indian patriot and a Pan-Africanist. He maintained a positive and supportive attitude to his homeland. He identified with other West Indians in the Gold Coast. He continued to practice activities and demonstrate values consistent with an expression of his West Indian heritage. He also left a legacy through his children. At the same time, he can be described as a Pan-Africanist. He was involved with the early Pan-Africanists in London in 1900. He was knowledgeable about Africa, and he fulfilled his desire to make his home there, and he contributed to the well-being of the society. Diaspora Studies, which include the study of the Back to Africa movements, are becoming increasingly relevant in the era of globalization. Now this study, the study that we are doing on Christian, has shown that history at the personal level can fill gaps in the available knowledge about the larger society. The unveiling of the details of the lives of these migrants, who must be seen as heroes in the Caribbean, is of importance for identity, heritage, and nation building in our emerging societies. This was Eugenia's point that I made at the beginning, and I have told you about Christian. We know more about the contribution which West Indians made to the Gold Coast, and this strengthens our connection with the African continent. As scholars and researchers continue to explore the phenomena of migration, Pan-Africanism, the Caribbean diaspora, heritage studies, and other related areas, it is also hoped that additional collections of personal papers and source materials will become available. In this way, the personal stories of others like Christian will find their place in the mosaic of the Black Atlantic world. Thank you. In these slides, I just acknowledge God, most important, and all the other people who helped me put the lecture together. My co-author, Mrs. Estelle P. I hope she's listening. The people in the libraries, I want to mention particularly Dr. Cheryl King, because the Dame Eugenia papers are in the KFL library, and I couldn't get there myself, but Dr. Cheryl King did all the research for me and looked up stuff. And the staff at St. Augustine, my former secretary, Larry Seals, did a beautiful PowerPoint that kept you all engaged. And I also had a research assistant who helped me with the information. And of course, my family, my husband, I mean, he's probably tired hearing about George and my relatives and so on. And I want to also say a very special thank you to Live Group, who organized my PowerPoint so that I didn't have to be fiddling with it while I gave the lecture. Thank you all very much for being very attentive to it.